Hello, fellow riders. Thank you so much for being here with me again for another episode of Catch Your Drift. This is the new series of videos I'm working on where I'm trying to help all the fellow producers out there who are working on music and maybe coming up against some challenges and are trying to look for some solutions to some things they're coming across. And hopefully some of my experience can help you and it'll give you a shortcut that will get you to where you're trying to go much quicker than where it took me initially. So, on this week's episode, I'm talking about a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. We're going to be talking about microphones on guitar cabinets and amps. So this is a subject I'm very interested in for a lot of reasons. The way that you record a guitar amplifier has a lot to do with where you're going to wind up in your final mix of your song. There's a lot of different elements that come into play with this, and I just want to try to highlight a few things before I get to some examples that I recorded. And I think in the examples, it's going to better illustrate the sound differences of how you use microphones and what it may do for you in your mix. But before we get into that, I just want to mention a few things. I think that one of the things that's so important about the way you record a guitar amplifier is obviously the way it sounds, but it's also about where are you putting your frequencies and how are those frequencies filling out your mix. When it comes down to the fact that you have, your whole band. Because, it's different trying to record a guitar amp to try to get the sound the best it can by itself versus the way it will in a whole mix. So, for example, what I mean by that is when you have drums and you have cymbals and you have bass and keyboards and vocals and maybe some other outside the box instruments, you get to this point where you have so many frequencies building up across your whole mix. And I think that having the knowledge of changing these microphones around and doing different things with them, that may be something that will help you as you're recording. So that way, by the time you get to your mix, maybe you won't have to fix problems that didn't need to be there in the first place. Of course, there's also a creative element to this as well. Not everybody wants the same guitar sound. I think it's great to have different options. And that probably ties me into the kind of one of the main reasons I made this video as well, is that in recent years, I see that there's a lot being said out there online about the different ways to record a guitar amplifier. And it seems that most people are kind of leaning towards two methods. They're either just using a dynamic microphone or they're using a dynamic microphone with a ribbon microphone. Now that makes sense for a lot of reasons. I think that's a really great way to do it. A dynamic microphone is going to capture your mid-range really well, and it will give you a bit of a boost in your kind of upper mid frequencies if you're using like a 57 style microphone. If you're adding in a ribbon microphone, that's going to kind of help capture more of your low mid frequencies. Again, that makes sense. Guitars are mid-range instruments, so capturing as much of your mid-range as possible, it makes a lot of sense. But I do think that there's other things to think about besides just trying to capture mid-range, and I think that there's elements of creativity that can be discussed in this and maybe could influence some things as well. One of the things that I like to do, for instance, is I like room microphones. Room microphones are used when you're pulling the microphone much further off the speaker than would be common in, say, close miking. Close miking is very common these days. You basically take your microphone, you try to get it as close as possible to the speaker, and that's just how you record it. You can move it around a little bit on the speaker. So for instance, if you want a brighter sound, you would put it very close to the center where the dust cap is. If you want to start making it a little bit less bright, a little warmer, maybe you start moving it off into the cone of the speaker more. You can move it in different directions and you can check and see how different parts of the speaker sound. You can decide what you like the best. But when you're close miking it like this very closely, you're going to get a lot of bass frequency as well. Now, getting bass frequencies, that's an important part of capturing a guitar signal. I don't think that there's anything wrong inherently with doing it that way. There's great information down there that you can use. But when you're thinking about things in the context of a whole mix, if you start to have lots of guitars, particularly if you're doing multiple layers of guitars, something that some people like to do, for instance, is like they like to quad track where they'll have a rhythm part and they'll they'll do traditional double tracking where they record the exact same part twice. They'll pan one hard left, they'll pan the other hard right, and then they'll do it again, pan again hard left, pan again hard right, and you'll wind up with two duplicates of essentially like the exact same track but played 4 times. When you start doing things like that, you have the potential to start building up a lot of low end frequencies in there. And you know, you don't have to do it 4 times. I don't do it 4 times. I don't even necessarily love double tracking for everything. I like to double track in sections, but I actually like the idea of coming up with 2 separate creative parts that interact well with each other a little bit more. And there's reasons for that, but we can get into that in a future video. But when you have these guitar signals in your mix, what you'll see is that it may be that some of what you're recording you don't actually even need in your final mix. Now, there's a variety of ways you can take care of that as well. For instance, on this microphone, there's actually a high pass filter right on it, which basically is also like a low cut. So it will cut out information before it's even recorded into this. So you could use something like that if you want. But when you're moving microphones around, that's free EQ basically. So you can, for instance, if this is, again, your guitar speaker, pulling it off a little bit, that starts to take out some of those bass frequencies. And I think something that's a really good solution if you want a little bit less bass is you can just pull it off a little bit even. You don't necessarily have to be right up on that, you know, cabinet. You can pull it off a little bit and you can take out some of those frequencies. If you pull it out a little bit further, say like 5 inches, which is one of the examples that I recorded that we'll be listening to today, that'll give you a different sound as well that you can compare. And then something that I really like to do is use room mics. So for instance, I'll put a 57 relatively close to the cabinet, but then I'll also take some other kind of microphone and I'll pull it back and I'll put it at a 3-to-1 distance of the microphones from the capsules from each other. So basically, you know, just a quick aside, when you're recording something, you want to line up your capsules so that way there's not an issue with phasing going out of alignment with each other. If this, for instance, on a 57 style, this is where the capsule is. It's right about there, right above the text. So if you record that there and then you kind of put your second microphone, like let's say right about here, there will be some phase cancellation there where actually, ironically, you'll lose the low end. But also, it's not so much just about losing the low end. You're also going to be hearing some weird, it's not distortion, but you'll hear a phase effect where the signals are kind of out of line with each other. It will kind of create an interesting sound, but it may not be a desirable sound. That's something that you can decide when you're recording. If it is a desirable sound, then you can put your microphones wherever you want. This is something where we are always saying, you know, get phase in alignment, get phase in alignment, get phase in alignment. Yes, get phase in alignment if that's what you want. If you don't want phase in alignment, then you can play with this as much as you want, and you can come up with some really interesting guitar sounds that way. They're going to be very specific and unique, so it's something you should probably decide, you know, as you're recording, because it's not a random sound. It's something that needs to fit into your mix. But anyway, just back to what I was saying before, something that you can do when you're using room mics is you can put your microphones at about a 3-to-1 distance. I don't have it measured out here exactly, but you can just kind of measure from the length of where the capsule is to the end of it and measure backwards for a 3-to-1 distance. What that will allow you to do is keep your phase in alignment, because once microphones get a 3-to-1 distance away from each other, the phase actually comes back in alignment with each other. So then you won't lose the low end, you'll get sounds that work together without introducing phasing. Another thing that's important with phase that doesn't get talked about so much is actually the further and further you go back in a room, the less and less typically phase is an issue to begin with. So if you want a really, really distant mic, for instance, you can do that, and that could be an interesting sound as well. You should obviously listen to all these sounds when you're recording and make sure that you like the way they're going into your DAW or however you're recording, because once it's recorded, that's what you're going to have to work with. But I think that it's good to talk about these subjects because it's great that everybody has come up with a kind of simple solution where, okay, if we take, for instance, a 57 and a ribbon microphone and we close mic them, it will just sound good the way it is. And that's great. I think that's a super good way to do things. But I also think it's important as artists that we expand our palette a little bit and we are willing to step outside the box and give ourselves more options, because you know there's a lot of things you can do as a creative person to come up with sounds that are different than other artists, and that can help your music stand out and sound different than other people's in interesting ways. And it starts to give you so many more options of ways you can combine things and layering with other instruments, layering with other types of guitars. Maybe you want to add a baritone, maybe you want to add a natural strung guitar. Maybe you can, I have a trick I like to do with a bass, for instance, that helps support the rhythm of the guitar. You don't use the bass for the bass. I mean, you'll still have a bass in your mix. This is something separate from that. You'll use the bass to kind of support the rhythm. And it's a bit of a weird trick. And I'll probably talk about this more in the future in another video. But when you start introducing those different elements into your mix, you start to be able to give yourself as an artist a creative voice and a creative distinction from other artists that can help you stand out. And I think in the end, there's just so much music out there online these days. I think we have to find ways to stand out from each other and show our, you know, it's great that we want to have commonalities and all these things. I think that's awesome, but I also think it's good to kind of have something that's a little bit different and says, hey, this is my statement of what I'm doing. That's a little bit different, and it represents, you know, something I'm trying to do that's interesting to me. I think this is a great reason to know your options when using microphones. So today, again, we're going to be focusing on a dynamic microphone and a small diaphragm condenser microphone. In the future, I want to do some more experiments with other types of microphones as well, with different positions. Again, another part of this that's interesting and probably worth talking about is it depends on what you're recording, what style you're recording, because the way you record heavy metal is probably different than the way you're going to record bluesy music. Having two close mics on an amp for a bluesy sound, I think that makes pretty good sense actually in a lot of ways, because it's okay to get a bit of a woolly sound in there. It can be interesting. But when you start getting into distorting guitars more and more, I think that's where, for me at least, you want to be careful about how much low end you're putting into there, because it can start to get a little bit maybe excessive. So when you're talking about recording metal amps, for instance, you may want something different. You may want a different sound in that. And I think that's good to know what your options are. So for instance, there are some techniques, I've done them in the past as well for heavier tracks, where maybe you've got your 57 there, and maybe another 57 or some other kind of microphone, and you're trying to line up your capsules, or you're doing something like this, where this second microphone will capture a bit more of a warmer sound, something a little bit less brittle. And that will help balance out the distortion you're getting from your 57 that's capturing that super well, with a bit of a warmer sound to kind of just fill out the overall frequencies of it. Again, there's so many different ways you can mic a guitar cabinet. I think it's great to just know what your options are and realize if you have an interesting idea, you should try it, because you might come up with something really wild. Something else I'm going to show in this video today is something where we do a bit of miking from behind the amp. That's something I really like as well. So anyway, these are just a few of the things I want to mention in this part of the video. I think it's probably helpful now to get in. I'll start showing you some examples. Like I said, there's going to be more videos of this type in the future as well, where I'm going to be discussing other different combinations of microphone types, microphone positions. I think this is a great starting point today. So let's go ahead, riders, and we'll listen to some examples. I think it's going to be great. Come on. All right, fellow riders, so here we are in the DAW now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some examples that I recorded and let you listen to some different versions. I recorded the microphones at a number of positions, and I also did some that were just going directly into the amp, and others utilize a boost pedal to give a heavier, more distorted sound out of it. And so first I'm just going to show all the microphones that I used, and I will also layer in some videos so that way you can see the different angles in real life, and in case it's something that you want to try out for yourself as well. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to hear the first example now. This is the 57 close mic'd as well as the small diaphragm condenser. Okay, so I think when you hear the small diaphragm condenser, you can tell there's quite a bit of a difference from the 57. To my ears, it sounds like you hear the top end a little bit better, and it sounds like the mids are scooped out a bit more. Let's go ahead and we'll listen to the same thing, 57 close and small diaphragm condenser close, but this time with the boost pedal. Okay, so again, I think we can hear there's quite a difference there. When you add that boost pedal in, it totally changes the character of the amp, obviously. And also, you're hearing the difference between the 57 and the small diaphragm microphone. At this point, I'm not really trying to highlight the differences between the different miking positions and the different microphones. I'm more just trying to demonstrate the different sounds we're going to be working with. And then later, we'll get into more of a comparison of how they all sound against each other, against how they sound paired with each other, and also with the differences when you hear all the boosted ones together and all the unboosted ones together. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to back the microphones off the amp now about 5 inches. They're still going to be in phase with each other at the same positions. So first I'm going to play the unboosted, then I'll go right into the boosted so you can hear that comparison. Okay, so the thing that's really interesting to me about these microphones is that you do still hear a difference when you pull the microphones 5 inches off between the 57 and the small diaphragm condenser. However, I would say that it's not as pronounced of a difference as when you have them close mic'd. So that is something that you can think about when you're recording, and you can play with that however you like. And for instance, if you only had one microphone type available to you, maybe at certain distances, it becomes less of a concern, the differences in tones that you're getting out of those microphones. And maybe there's other ways you can make up for it in your mix. So something to think about. Now for the last 3 microphones I want to show, 2 of them are going to be room microphones. So these ones were backed way off the amp. One of them is going to be boosted, one of them unboosted. And the other one is something I like to do that's different from all these other ones. It's putting a microphone on the back of the amp. This only works if you have an open back cabinet. But if you do, you can get it in behind and you can match it up so that way it's the same distance from your front mic. Something important to remember is that if you do this, you do need to flip the polarity on the back mic. So that way the signals match up correctly and they don't cancel each other out with your front microphone. So let's go ahead and we'll take a listen to that now. So you can probably tell now that those mics all sound a little bit different than what we heard before. The room mics will sound pretty interesting, I think, when we put them in context with some of the other microphones. And the back mic sounds really different. It picks up a lot more low end. You hear a very specific kind of grunt with the tone that I'm using. And you hear a very specific kind of room tone as well. So let's go ahead. I'm going to start pairing these up with each other so you can hear a little bit more of how maybe they would be used in a mix. The first thing that I'm going to do is pair up the 57 and the small diaphragm condenser close mics. On the left side, you're going to hear the unboosted signal, and on the right side, you're going to hear the boosted signal. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like now. Something that I really like here with using the boosted on one side versus the unboosted on the other side is that you're hearing a bit more width than if you just use the exact same tone on both sides. I think that's something that's really important in recording. I think it really helps when you can hear just enough of those differences to create the best overall sound possible. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll jump into the next example. This one's going to have the microphones 5 inches off the speaker, panned left for the unboosted signal, and panned right for the boosted signal. Let's hear it. So for me, the main differences I hear are there's definitely less low end when you start pulling the microphones off. Again, that makes sense from what we reviewed before. And also you can start to pick up a bit more of the sound from the room a little bit. One of the things that's interesting to me about this as well is that if you start to pull those microphones off, you can almost hear how you're moving the microphones back in the mix a little bit. So that's also something that you can think about when you're mixing and recording, and you can kind of decide up front, if there's certain parts you want, maybe how forward or how back do you want in the mix. And this is a technique you could use to try to accomplish that before you even get to the mixing stage. Okay, let's go ahead and check out the next example now. For this one, I did something a little bit different. I have the close mic back in the mix, and I also have the furthest off mic, the room mic, in there on both sides. So again, you're gonna hear unboosted on the left, boosted on the right. Okay, let's check it out now. Okay, so that's a sound that I really like personally. You get the up closeness from the 57, but you also get this deeper room sound from it, and for me, they layer up really nicely. So that's a great option. I think there might be an even more interesting option, and we're gonna listen to that now. Basically, it involves doing the same thing that we just did, but I also include a microphone in the back. I mentioned earlier, this is if you have an open back cabinet, you can do this. So if you put that back microphone into the mix, it starts to bring in a bit more low end. And I feel like that really helps fill out the sound nicely when you're using this distant room mic, because that distant room mic, it's picking up very, very little low end and low mid range. So it kind of helps fill out the sound really nicely. Let's check it out now. Okay, so I think that's a great option. Maybe I wouldn't do that on both sides of the mix. Maybe I'd only use it for the left main guitar and then the right main rhythm guitar. I would do something different. You could pair it up with using maybe 3 microphones on the left and 2 on the right in different positions and capture some interesting sounds. One of the things I'm hoping that this exercise shows is that you can get a lot of different interesting sounds by moving your microphones around. And I think it's a great thing to have your toolkit when you're making a song, because maybe you want something that's just very different than what you hear typically out there these days. And I think that having these different positions to play around with, it'll probably start to spark your creativity a little bit. Like I said, there's many more options as well that you can use for putting microphones on a guitar amp or cabinet, and you can come up with a really interesting and wide array of sounds. In the future, we'll be exploring more of that as well with more microphone types, more positions. But for today, I think that's a great place to stop, and it gives you a lot to think about in terms of what your options are at this point, even if you just have a small diaphragm and a 57 laying around. So just to end this video, I want to play all the examples, one right after another, and I grouped them together so that way you can hear the unboosted sounds as well as the boosted sounds afterwards. So that kind of gives you a really good comparison of the differences. So I just want to say again, thank you so much, fellow riders, for joining us again for another episode of Catch Your Drift. There'll be another episode coming soon. If you can like and subscribe and comment and do all that fun stuff, it really helps the channel. And of course, this was quite a long video in the end. If there is anything that you would recommend that would help make this easier for you, I don't know if maybe you would like shorter sound examples or you'd like something just a little bit different, just please feel free to let me know, and I will keep it in mind as I'm making more of these videos. So, thanks again, fellow riders, and I'll see you soon.